Sarah Blackwood stepped out of her rental car and gazed up at the two-story Victorian house that had belonged to her great-grandfather. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the overgrown yard, and a chill wind swept through Deadwood, South Dakota, carrying the scent of pine and approaching rain. After 15 years away, the town felt both familiar and foreign. "Quite the inheritance," remarked Martin, her husband, as he joined her on the cracked sidewalk. "Your aunt kept this place all these years, just to leave it to you?" Sarah nodded, clutching the heavy brass key. Aunt Eliza was the last one who cared about preserving family history. She always said this house held secrets worth keeping. The lawyer's letter had arrived 3 weeks ago, informing Sarah that her elderly aunt had passed away, leaving her the ancestral home and all its contents. Sarah hadn't visited Deadwood since she was a teenager, when her parents had abruptly packed up and moved to California, refusing to ever discuss why they'd left so suddenly. As they approached the wraparound porch, Sarah noticed the peeling paint and sagging steps. The house had good bones, but years of minimal maintenance had taken their toll. Inside, the air was stale and heavy with dust. Sheets covered the furniture like ghosts of a bygone era. "We should open some windows," Martin suggested, coughing slightly. Sarah moved through the foyer, memories flooding back. The ornate banister she'd slid down as a child, the creaky third step she'd always jumped over. The parlor where Aunt Eliza told stories of the gold rush days, when Deadwood was wild and lawless. "I'll start upstairs," Sarah said. "The lawyer mentioned there's a study where Aunt Eliza kept all the family documents. Apparently she was obsessed with genealogy in her final years." The stairs protested under her weight. On the second floor, Sarah found the study, a small room lined with bookshelves and filing cabinets. A large oak desk dominated the space, its surface covered with papers, old photographs, and leather-bound journals. Sarah sat in the worn leather chair and picked up a framed photograph. It showed a stern-looking man with a thick beard standing behind a seated woman holding an infant. The man's eyes seemed to follow her, uncomfortably intense, even through the sepia tones. "Jonathan Blackwood, 1892, read the inscription on the back. As Sarah placed the photograph back on the desk, she noticed a leather portfolio labeled "Blackwood Lineage, Private." Her fingers trembled slightly as she untied the string, fastening it closed. Inside was a meticulously drawn family tree with notes in Aunt Eliza's spidery handwriting. Something caught her eye, a name crossed out with heavy black ink, accompanied by a small note. "Never speak this name. The focusing brings them through." Sarah frowned, puzzled by the cryptic warning. She continued examining the documents until Martin called from downstairs. "Sarah, you might want to see this." In the parlor, Martin stood before a wall where he had removed one of the dusty sheets. Revealed was a large portrait, the same family from the photograph upstairs, but rendered in oils, life-sized and disturbingly lifelike. "That's odd," Sarah murmured, approaching the painting. "There's something wrong with their eyes." Indeed, while the rest of the portrait was skillfully executed, the eyes of each family member appeared blurred, as if the artist had deliberately smudged them. "Probably just damaged over time," Martin suggested, though he sounded uncertain. As Sarah stared at the portrait, a floorboard creaked behind them. Both turned, but the hallway was empty. Outside, the wind had picked up, and rain began to patter against the windows. Something about the portrait made Sarah deeply uneasy, though she couldn't articulate why. "Let's call it a day," she said finally. "We can come back tomorrow and start sorting through everything." That night in their hotel room, Sarah dreamed of the portrait. In her dream, the eyes were no longer blurred but sharply focused, staring directly at her, and behind the family stood shadowy figures, their outlines human but their features indistinct. She woke, gasping, the phrase from Aunt Eliza's notes echoing in her mind. "The focusing brings them through." The next morning dawned grey and drizzly, matching Sarah's mood as they returned to the house. She'd slept poorly, troubled by her dream and a persistent sense of unease. "I want to check the local historical society today," she told Martin over coffee in the dusty kitchen. Aunt Eliza mentioned in her letter that she donated some family items there. Maybe they have information about that portrait. "Good idea," Martin agreed. "I'll stay here and start clearing out some of these rooms. Your aunt was quite the collector." The Deadwood Historical Society occupied a former bank building downtown. Inside, Sarah found a helpful archivist named Dr. Eleanor Hart, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and wire-rimmed glasses. "Blackwood," Dr. Hart repeated, eyes widening slightly. "Yes, we have a collection donated by Eliza Blackwood. Fascinating family history." Dr. Hart led Sarah to a research room and returned moments later with a box of materials. "Your family was quite prominent during the gold rush era. Jonathan Blackwood made a fortune in mining claims, though there were rumors." "What kind of rumors?" Sarah asked. Dr. Hart hesitated. "Nothing substantial, just the usual gossip that follows sudden wealth. Though there was an incident in 1893, several miners who worked Blackwood claims disappeared, never solved." Sarah sifted through the box, finding newspaper clippings, property deeds, and more photographs. One yellowed newspaper article caught her attention. "Tragedy strikes Blackwood home. Painter Peters found dead. Family portrait unfinished." According to the article, a commissioned portrait artist named Thomas Peters had been found dead in the Blackwood home in 1892, apparently from a self-inflicted wound. The article mentioned that Peters had been working on a family portrait, which remained unfinished. "But the portrait at the house looks complete," Sarah murmured. "What was that?" Dr. Hart asked. "There's a finished portrait at the house. If Peters died before completing it, who finished it?" Dr. Hart frowned. "That's odd. According to our records, the portrait was never completed. Eliza actually donated Peters' preliminary sketches." She pulled out a folder containing charcoal drawings of Jonathan Blackwood and his wife. Sarah studied the sketches. The faces were recognizable as the same people in the portrait, but something was different. In these drawings, the eyes were clear and normal, not blurred like in the painting. As she continued examining the materials, Sarah found a small leather diary with E.B. 1976 stamped on the cover. Inside was Aunt Eliza's handwriting, documenting her early genealogical research. One entry made Sarah's blood run cold. "Found grandmother's journal. She claims the portrait was deliberately altered after Peter's death. Jonathan insisted the eyes be obscured. They must not focus or they will come through." What did he fear? What did Peters see? Sarah showed the diary to Dr. Hart, who read it with growing concern. "There's a local legend," Dr. Hart said hesitantly, "about certain portraits serving as doorways. Old mining superstition. If the eyes in a portrait are too lifelike, too focused, they can become a passage for something else. Spirits, perhaps, or worse. The miners called them shadow folk." "That sounds like superstition," Sarah said, though a chill ran down her spine. "Of course," Dr. Hart agreed quickly. "Just old tales. Still, it's interesting that your great-grandfather would be concerned about such things." When Sarah returned to the house that afternoon, she found Martin in the basement, examining old trunks. "You wouldn't believe what I found," he said excitedly, holding up a small wooden box. "Gold dust and some raw nuggets, quite valuable, I'd guess." But Sarah wasn't listening. On the wall behind Martin hung another portrait, smaller than the one upstairs, but unmistakably the same family. In this version, however, the eyes were not blurred. They were sharply focused, staring directly outward, and barely visible behind the family stood shadowy figures, just like in her dream. "Martin," she whispered, "where did you find that painting?" "It was wrapped in canvas behind those trunks. Strange that they'd hide it away. It's in better condition than the one upstairs." As Sarah stared at the portrait, she could have sworn the eyes followed her movement. Outside, thunder rumbled, and the basement lights flickered momentarily. "We should go back upstairs," Sarah said, unable to shake her growing dread. That evening, as rain lashed against the windows, Sarah shared what she'd learned at the Historical Society. Martin listened skeptically. "Shadow folk coming through portraits? That's ridiculous," he scoffed. "Your aunt was probably just eccentric, and these local legends grew around ordinary events. Then why are there two versions of the same portrait? And why would they deliberately blur the eyes in one?" Martin shrugged. "Artists experiment. Maybe they didn't like how the first one turned out." But Sarah couldn't dismiss her concerns so easily. That night she dreamed again of the portrait. But this time the shadowy figures behind the family were clearer, their featureless faces turned toward her, and they were closer to the foreground, as if they had taken a step forward. She awoke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside their hotel room, but when Martin checked, there was no one there. The storm intensified overnight, and by morning, reports of flooding had closed several roads out of Deadwood. Sarah and Martin returned to the house to find water seeping into the basement. "We need to move those portraits and other valuables to higher ground," Martin insisted, heading downstairs. Sarah followed reluctantly, her unease growing stronger as they approached the smaller portrait with the focused eyes. In daylight, it seemed less threatening, but she still avoided looking directly at it. As they carefully removed the portrait from the wall, Sarah noticed writing on the back, "J. Blackwood, second sitting, completed by J.B. after Peter's departure." So Jonathan finished it himself, Sarah mused. But why make a version with clear eyes when the main portrait has them blurred? They carried the portrait upstairs and leaned it against the wall in the study, next to the desk where Sarah had found the genealogy records. Outside, the rain continued to fall in sheets, drumming against the roof and windows. "I need to check the attic for leaks," Martin said. "The last thing we need is water damage to the ceiling." While Martin headed to the attic, Sarah returned to Aunt Eliza's genealogy documents, searching for more information about Jonathan Blackwood. In a manila folder labeled Family Incidents, she found newspaper clippings documenting a series of tragedies that had befallen the Blackwoods in the years following 1892. Jonathan's wife had died in 1894 under mysterious circumstances. Their son had grown to adulthood but became increasingly reclusive, claiming to see shadow people watching him. He eventually committed suicide in 1921. The pattern continued through generations. Unusual deaths, mental breakdowns, and disturbing claims about being watched by entities no one else could see. A journal entry from Jonathan himself, dated December 1892, caught Sarah's attention. "Peters saw them during the sitting, said they were standing behind us, watching. He became obsessed with capturing them in the portrait. When I saw his work, how he had focused the eyes to create the doorway, I knew what would happen. I had no choice. The second portrait remains my burden to bear, but it must never be displayed. The eyes must remain unfocused, or they will come through entirely." A crash from upstairs interrupted Sarah's reading. "Martin!" she called, but received no response. Hurrying up to the attic, she found the access door open, but no sign of her husband. "Martin!" she called again, her voice echoing in the rafters. The attic was cluttered with old furniture and trunks. A small window let in grey light, barely illuminating the dusty space. Water dripped from a spot in the roof, forming a puddle on the wooden floor. Sarah noticed a trunk that had been opened, its contents partially removed. Beside it lay Martin's phone, but her husband was nowhere to be seen. As she picked up the phone, Sarah heard a floorboard creak behind her. She turned, expecting to see Martin, but instead found herself facing an empty corner where shadows seemed unnaturally deep despite the meager light filtering through the window. "Martin, this isn't funny," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The shadows rippled, though nothing in the room had moved. Sarah backed toward the attic door, a primal fear gripping her. As she reached the ladder, she glanced back one last time and froze. For just an instant, she thought she saw a figure in the shadows, humanoid but wrong somehow, its proportions slightly off, its face a featureless void. Sarah descended the ladder so quickly she nearly fell. Back on the second floor, she called Martin's name repeatedly, searching room by room, but found no trace of him. When she returned to the study, she stopped cold. The smaller portrait, the one with the focused eyes, had been moved. It now hung on the wall, where previously there had been only wallpaper. Worse, the figures in the portrait had changed. The shadowy forms behind the family were more distinct now, closer to the foreground, and one appeared to be partially emerging from the canvas, its arm extending beyond the frame. Sarah stumbled backward, her heart racing. She had to find Martin and get out of this house. As she turned to leave the study, the door slammed shut. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs of vapor. On the desk, the pages of Aunt Eliza's genealogy records began to flip, as if caught in a breeze, though the air was still. They stopped at the family tree, where Sarah now noticed something she'd missed before. There was a branch extending from Jonathan Blackwood to a name that had been heavily inked out, and beside it, in different handwriting, "The exchange was made. The focusing cannot be undone." Outside, thunder crashed, and the lights in the study flickered and went out. In the sudden darkness, Sarah fumbled for her phone, activating its flashlight. The beam caught dust motes swirling in the air, disturbed by an unfelt current. She tried the door again, but it remained firmly shut as if held by an unseen force. "Martin!" she shouted, pounding on the wood. "Can you hear me?" Only silence answered, broken by the steady drumming of rain against the windows and the occasional rumble of thunder. Sarah's flashlight beam swept across the room, landing on the portrait. Her blood ran cold. The painting had changed again. Now, one of the shadowy figures had fully emerged from the background and stood beside the Blackwood family, its featureless face turned directly toward the viewer. The painted Jonathan Blackwood's expression had changed too. His formerly stern countenance now reflected unmistakable terror. As Sarah watched, paralyzed with horror, a dark stain seemed to spread from the portrait onto the wall around it, like ink bleeding through paper. The stain extended outward, forming a shadow that didn't match the contours of the frame. Sarah backed away until she hit the desk. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. This couldn't be happening. Portraits didn't change, shadows didn't move of their own accord, yet the evidence before her eyes contradicted everything she knew about reality. She remembered Dr. Hart's words about the miner's superstition, portraits serving as doorways if the eyes were too focused. Jonathan's written warning echoed in her mind. The eyes must remain unfocused, or they will come through entirely. The shadow continued to expand across the wall, and within it, Sarah could discern movement, as if something was pushing against a membrane, trying to break through. The air grew colder still, and Sarah's phone flickered, the flashlight dimming momentarily. In that brief moment of darkness, she heard it, a sound like dry paper rustling, or perhaps whispered words in a language she couldn't understand. When the light stabilized, the shadow on the wall had formed a distinct shape, a doorway. Sarah lunged for the study door again, twisting the knob frantically. This time it opened, and she stumbled into the hallway. The house had grown unnaturally dark despite it being midday, as if the storm outside had intensified to block all natural light. "Martin!" she called again, her voice echoing through the empty corridors. A noise from downstairs drew her attention, the sound of breaking glass. Sarah descended the stairs cautiously, her phone's flashlight providing meager illumination. In the parlor, she found the source of the noise. The large portrait, the one with the blurred eyes, had fallen to the floor, its frame broken and canvas torn. As Sarah approached it, she noticed that the blurring around the eyes had begun to clear, the painted gazes coming into focus just like in the smaller portrait upstairs. And behind the family, shadowy figures were becoming visible where none had been before. "It's happening again," she whispered, understanding dawning with horrifying clarity. A creak on the stairs made her turn. Martin stood on the bottom step, but something was wrong. He moved stiffly, his expression blank, and his eyes were wrong, somehow deeper and darker than they should be, like holes leading to someplace infinitely distant. "Martin," Sarah whispered. When he spoke, his voice was flat and slightly distorted, as if someone were poorly mimicking his speech patterns. "Sarah, you should see what I've seen. Through the doorway, they've been waiting so long." He took a step toward her, moving with an unnatural gait, his joints bending at odd angles. "The focusing is complete now. They're coming through, all of them." Sarah backed away, her mind reeling. This wasn't Martin, or at least not entirely Martin. "What have you done with my husband?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "He's here," not Martin replied, gesturing vaguely toward himself. "Part of him. Parts of many. The exchange requires vessels." From the shadows of the dining room emerged another figure, human in outline but wrong in its movements, like a puppet controlled by an unskilled operator. As it stepped into the dim light cast by Sarah's phone, she saw it was the spitting image of Jonathan Blackwood from the portrait, though his features seemed blurred in person, as if he were slightly out of focus with reality itself. "The portrait artist saw us," the Jonathan thing said, its voice a dry whisper. "He made the doorway with his art. Your ancestor tried to close it by blurring the eyes, but he kept the second portrait, his mistake, his greed. He thought he could control the exchange, use our gifts to find more gold. But we required payment." Sarah's back hit the wall. There was nowhere left to retreat. "What do you want?" she asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "To come through," not Martin replied simply. "To be, we have existed in the in-between for so long, watching, waiting. Now the bloodline has returned, and the focusing is complete." The Jonathan thing took another step forward. "Your aunt tried to warn you with her notes. She knew what would happen if you came back, if you looked too closely at the portraits. But blood calls to blood, and the doorway required a Blackwood to open fully." Sarah's mind raced. If the portraits were doorways, perhaps they could be closed again. She remembered Aunt Eliza's crossed-out note. "Never speak this name. The focusing brings them through." The opposite must also be true, she reasoned. If focusing brought them through, then unfocusing, blurring the connection, might send them back. With sudden determination, Sarah lunged past the Martin thing, barely avoiding its grasp, and ran to the fallen portrait. Behind her, she heard the whisper rustling sound growing louder as more shadow folk emerged from the darkness. Grabbing a shard of broken glass from the portrait frame, Sarah began scraping at the painted eyes, blurring them deliberately. "You don't belong here," she shouted. "Go back to wherever you came from." The house began to shake, picture frames rattling against walls, furniture sliding across floors. The shadow folk moved toward her, their movements becoming more erratic, more desperate. Not Martin reached for her. "Stop! The doorway must remain open." But Sarah continued, defacing the portrait with frantic strokes, obliterating the eyes that had been the focus of the doorway. As she worked, the storm outside reached a crescendo, lightning illuminating the room in strobing flashes. The Jonathan thing began to waver, its form becoming less substantial. "We will return," it hissed. "The focusing always happens eventually. We are patient. We have eternity." With a final, desperate effort, Sarah completely destroyed the eyes in the portrait. A tremendous crash of thunder shook the house to its foundations, and for an instant, everything went completely silent and still. Then, with a sound like rushing wind, the shadow folk were pulled back, not into the portrait, but into the very shadows of the room, which seemed to deepen and swirl before returning to normal. The Martin thing reached for Sarah one last time, before it too was swept away into darkness. The lights flickered back on. The storm outside began to subside. And there, lying unconscious on the floor beside her, was Martin, the real Martin. Sarah crawled to him, checking for a pulse. He was alive, though his skin was cold to the touch. As she cradled his head, his eyes fluttered open, normal eyes, confused but present. "What happened?" he murmured. "I was in the attic. And then, darkness. Voices I couldn't get back." Sarah helped him sit up, relief washing over her. "It's over now," she said, though uncertainty lingered. "We need to leave this house. Today." As they made their way outside, the rain had stopped, and weak sunlight broke through the clouds. Sarah looked back at the house, knowing what needed to be done. The portraits would have to be destroyed completely. The house itself, perhaps it too would have to go. "We're never coming back here," she told Martin as they drove away. "Some family legacies aren't worth preserving." But even as they left Deadwood behind, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them, not a physical presence, but a connection that had been established and could not be completely severed. In her mind, she heard the Jonathan thing's final words: "We are patient. We have eternity." Udi. That night, in their hotel room many miles from Deadwood, Sarah avoided looking too closely at her own reflection in the mirror, afraid of what might be watching from the other side, with focused eyes, waiting for another chance to come through. 3 months later, Sarah and Martin had settled back into their life in Seattle. The house in Deadwood had been sold to a developer who planned to demolish it and build vacation cabins, a decision that brought Sarah immense relief. She had taken only a few family documents from Aunt Eliza's collection, leaving the rest to be disposed of with the house. But the memories of what had happened there continued to haunt her. She slept poorly, often waking from nightmares in which shadowy figures stood at the foot of her bed, watching with invisible eyes. Sometimes, in the liminal space between wakefulness and sleep, she thought she heard the dry, rustling whispers from the study. Martin had recovered physically from his ordeal, though he claimed to remember little of what had happened. "It's like a dream I can't quite recall," he would say when Sarah pressed him. "Just impressions of cold and darkness." But Sarah noticed how he now avoided having his photograph taken and had removed all mirrors from their bedroom. On a rainy Tuesday evening, Sarah sat at her desk reviewing patient files. She had returned to her psychology practice, finding comfort in the routine and rationality of her work. A notification on her computer indicated a new email had arrived. The sender's name made her freeze: Eleanor Hart, the archivist from the Deadwood Historical Society. With reluctance, Sarah opened the message. "Dear Ms. Blackwood, I hope this message finds you well. I'm writing regarding some disturbing developments concerning your family's artifacts. After your departure, we received the items you left behind from the estate sale. While cataloguing them, my assistant discovered something unusual about the family photographs in the collection. In several of the older images, we've noticed what appear to be anomalies, indistinct figures in the backgrounds that weren't visible before. More troublingly, these anomalies seem to be appearing in other photographs stored nearby, including completely unrelated collections. I recall our conversation about the portrait and the local legends. Given the circumstances, I felt obligated to inform you. If convenient, would you be willing to discuss this matter further? Respectfully, Dr. Eleanor Hart. Attached to the email was a scan of a Blackwood family photograph from 1912. One Sarah recognized from Aunt Eliza's study. In the background, barely visible but unmistakable to Sarah's trained eye, was the suggestion of a figure standing behind the family, its features indistinct but its presence undeniable. Sarah closed the email without responding, her heart racing. They hadn't been contained by destroying the portraits. Somehow they had found another way through, another focusing. That night, she dreamed of Jonathan Blackwood standing in her bedroom, his features blurred except for his eyes, which were unnaturally sharp and focused. "Blood calls to blood," he said in that dry, whisper voice. "The doorway remains. We are patient." Sarah awoke gasping, Martin's arm around her. "Another nightmare?" he asked groggily. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Outside, rain tapped against the windows, reminding her too much of that day in Deadwood. The next morning, Sarah found herself staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, studying her own eyes with disturbing intensity. Was it her imagination, or did the shadows in the corners of the room seem deeper than they should be? As she prepared for work, she noticed Martin watching her with an odd expression. "What?" she asked, unnerved by his scrutiny. "Nothing," he replied, looking away quickly. "Just, you look different for a moment. A trick of the light." Sarah tried to dismiss his comment, but it lingered in her mind as she drove to her office. The day passed in a blur of appointments and paperwork, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Several times she caught herself staring at the photographs on her office wall, family pictures, vacation snapshots, her psychology degree, searching the backgrounds for signs of intrusion. Her last patient of the day, an elderly man suffering from paranoia, paused mid-sentence during their session and stared over Sarah's shoulder. "Is someone else here?" he asked, his voice trembling. Sarah turned, but saw only the empty corner of her office. "We're alone, Mr. Jenkins," she assured him, though a chill ran down her spine. "No," he insisted. "There's someone standing right there. Can't you see them? They're watching you." After Mr. Jenkins left, Sarah found herself reluctant to stay in her office alone. She packed up quickly, avoiding looking directly at the darkening corners as twilight approached. At home, she found Martin in the spare bedroom they had converted to a home office, surrounded by printouts of old photographs, the few family images Sarah had brought from Deadwood. "What are you doing?" she asked, alarmed. Martin looked up, his expression intense. "I've been scanning these at high resolution." "There's something here, Sarah, look." He pointed to a digitally enhanced image on his computer screen, a photograph of Jonathan Blackwood standing outside the Deadwood house. Behind him, partially obscured by shadow, was the unmistakable outline of a figure that should not have been there. "I see them now," Martin said quietly. "I didn't before, but now I do. In all the photographs. Watching. Waiting." Sarah felt a surge of panic. "Martin, you need to stop this. Destroy those photographs. Delete the scans." But Martin shook his head, his eyes never leaving the screen. "Don't you see? This proves it wasn't just a hallucination or a shared delusion. They're real, Sarah. They've always been real." Sarah noticed something disturbing. Martin's reflection in the computer screen didn't quite match his movements, as if it were operating on a slight delay. And his eyes in the reflection seemed wrong somehow. Too focused, too intense. "Martin," she said carefully, "I think we should get away for a while. Take a trip somewhere, anywhere but here." He nodded absently, still staring at the photograph. "They followed us from Deadwood, you know. Or maybe they were always everywhere, just waiting for someone to see them, to focus on them." That night, Sarah lay awake long after Martin had fallen asleep, listening to the house settle and creak. Every shadow seemed suspicious, every dark corner potentially hiding something watching with invisible eyes. Just as she was finally drifting off, she heard it, the dry, rustling whisper from the hallway outside their bedroom. Sarah froze, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe. The bedroom door, which had been closed, slowly began to open. In the sliver of darkness revealed, Sarah could discern nothing concrete, and yet she knew with absolute certainty that something stood there, watching. "Martin!" she whispered urgently, shaking her husband's shoulder. But Martin didn't stir, his breathing remaining deep and regular. The door opened wider. The darkness in the hallway seemed deeper than it should be, more absolute, as if light itself was being absorbed. And within that darkness something moved. Sarah reached for the bedside lamp with a trembling hand and switched it on. Light flooded the room, pushing back the shadows, but not entirely. For in the doorway stood a figure, humanoid but wrong, its proportions slightly off, its features indistinct except for its eyes, which were unnaturally sharp and focused. It was Martin, and yet not Martin. A duplicate of her husband standing in the doorway while the real Martin slept beside her. The not Martin's mouth moved, forming words without sound, but somehow Sarah understood them anyway. The focusing is nearly complete, Sarah screamed, finally waking Martin. He bolted upright, disoriented, as Sarah pointed frantically toward the door. But the doorway was empty now, the hallway beyond merely dark in an ordinary way. There was someone there, Sarah insisted, her voice shaking. It looked like you, but it wasn't you. Martin held her, murmuring reassurances, but Sarah felt no comfort, because as he embraced her, she caught sight of their reflection in the dresser mirror across the room. And in that reflection, the arms holding her were not Martin's at all, but elongated, wrong-angled limbs that belonged to something else entirely, something that was wearing her husband like a poorly fitted suit. Sarah pulled away from Martin's embrace, unable to hide her horror as she glanced between him and his distorted reflection in the mirror. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice normal, concerned, but the reflection's mouth moved differently, out of sync, like a poorly dubbed film. "The mirror," Sarah whispered, pointing with a trembling finger. "Look at yourself in the mirror." Martin turned toward the dresser, but as he did, the reflection blurred momentarily, then settled into a perfect match of his movements. When he looked back at Sarah, his expression was puzzled. "I don't see anything strange, just me." But Sarah had seen it, the momentary slip, the glimpse of what was hiding behind Martin's appearance. The question now was whether something had possessed her husband or was merely impersonating him. Either possibility was terrifying. "I need some water," she said, desperate for an excuse to leave the bedroom. "I'll be right back." In the kitchen, Sarah's mind raced. If she couldn't trust Martin, or whatever was pretending to be Martin, then she was truly alone. She took out her phone, intending to call someone, anyone, but stopped. Who would believe her? What could she even say? As she filled a glass at the sink, Sarah caught movement in the kitchen window. In the reflection of the darkened glass, she could see into the hallway behind her, where a figure stood watching. But when she spun around, the hallway was empty. Sarah's hands shook so badly that water sloshed over the rim of the glass. These reflections, they were showing the truth that her eyes couldn't or wouldn't see. A theory formed in her mind, drawing on both her professional knowledge of psychology and the supernatural events she had witnessed. Perhaps the shadow folk couldn't fully manifest in this world yet. Perhaps they could only partially come through, existing in reflections and photographs, in the corners of vision and the darkness between moments. The focusing wasn't complete, but it was progressing. Sarah returned to the bedroom, where Martin had fallen back asleep, or appeared to be sleeping. Carefully, she gathered her phone, wallet, and car keys. Whatever was happening, she needed distance and time to think. She drove aimlessly through the rainy Seattle streets, eventually finding herself at an all-night diner. Over a cup of coffee that she didn't drink, Sarah opened her laptop and began searching for information about the legend Dr. Hart had mentioned. Portraits serving as doorways, shadow folk, anything that might help her understand what was happening. Most of what she found was standard folklore about haunted paintings and doppelgangers, nothing specific to Deadwood or the phenomenon she was experiencing. But then she discovered an obscure thesis paper titled "Liminal Entities in Black Hills Mining Folklore" by a graduate student named Michael Chen. Chen's paper documented legends from various mining communities, including a recurring theme among Deadwood miners in the 1890s, stories of shadow folk, or the Watchers Between, who could be accidentally summoned through artistic representations. According to the legends, these entities existed in a space between dimensions and were drawn to points of focus, particularly the focused gaze in portraits or photographs. One passage made Sarah's blood run cold. Miners believed these entities required a human vessel to fully manifest in our world. The process, called the exchange, supposedly began with reflections and progressed to full possession. Early symptoms included a subject seeing their own reflection move independently or appear distorted. The paper mentioned several historical cases, including a painter who claimed his portraits were being altered overnight, figures appearing in the backgrounds that he hadn't painted. The painter had eventually been committed to an asylum after attempting to blind himself, claiming, "I must unfocus my eyes so they cannot use them as doorways." Sarah was so engrossed in her reading that she didn't notice the waitress approach until a coffee pot appeared in her peripheral vision, offering a refill. "No thanks," Sarah said, glancing up. The waitress smiled and moved away, but in the reflective surface of the napkin dispenser, Sarah caught a glimpse of something else entirely. Not a waitress, but a tall, gangling figure with proportions that defied human anatomy. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. They were everywhere now, hiding in reflections, watching her. Chen's paper had mentioned that the exchange accelerated once it began, the entities growing stronger as they found more points of focus. A new, horrifying thought struck her. What if her own intense focus on the shadow folk was making them stronger? By obsessively looking for them in every reflection, was she inadvertently providing them with more doorways? Sarah closed her laptop and paid her bill, hurrying back to her car. She needed to find someone who might understand, someone who had studied these phenomena. The author of the paper, Michael Chen, might still be at the university where he'd published his thesis. A quick online search revealed that Chen was now Dr. Chen, an associate professor of anthropology specializing in folklore and superstition at the University of Washington. Sarah found his faculty email and sent an urgent message, explaining as rationally as possible that she was experiencing phenomena similar to those described in his paper and needed to consult with him immediately. To her surprise, an automated response came back instantly. "I am on sabbatical conducting field research in South Dakota until June. For urgent matters, please contact the department office." South Dakota. The coincidence was too perfect to be chance. Somehow Chen had been drawn to the same phenomena that were now haunting her. Perhaps he knew more than what had been in his paper. Dawn was breaking as Sarah drove home, uncertain what to do next. She couldn't avoid returning to the house, to Martin, indefinitely, but she was terrified of what might be waiting for her there. As she pulled into the driveway, she noticed that all the curtains in the house were drawn, unusual for Martin, who preferred natural light. With trembling hands, she unlocked the front door and stepped inside. "Martin!" she called. The house was silent and felt unnaturally cold. In the living room, Sarah found all the framed photographs that usually adorned the walls arranged in a circle on the floor. In the center sat Martin, cross-legged, staring at them intently. "Martin," she tried again, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up slowly, his movements fluid, but somehow wrong, as if his joints worked differently now. "They're growing stronger," he said, his voice normal, but his speech patterns strangely formal. "The focusing is nearly complete. Soon they will come through fully." "Who are you?" Sarah demanded, though she dreaded the answer. "What have you done with my husband?" "I am Martin," he replied, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Part of me is Martin. Parts of me are older, much older. We exist in the spaces between. We watch. We wait. We come through when invited." "I never invited you," Sarah said, backing toward the door. "But you did," not Martin countered, rising with that same fluid wrongness. "Your blood invited us. Jonathan Blackwood invited us first, seeking our knowledge of gold beneath the earth. We showed him where to dig in exchange for access, a foothold. Your ancestor tried to close the doorway, but blood calls to blood. Your aunt knew. She tried to warn you with her notes, her crossed-out names." Sarah remembered the name crossed out in Aunt Eliza's genealogy records. "What name was crossed out in the family tree?" she asked, stalling for time as she inched toward the front door. Not Martin's smile widened unnaturally. "The first exchange. The child in the portrait, not a Blackwood by blood? A vessel? The artist saw the truth when he painted the eyes. He saw us waiting behind the family. That's why he had to be removed. And now you're doing the same to Martin," Sarah said, anger momentarily overcoming her fear. "The exchange is incomplete." Not Martin admitted, his smile faltering. Your husband resists. His focus shifts. But we are patient. Sarah's back hit the front door. Outside, morning had fully broken, sunlight streaming through the windows where the curtains didn't fully close. She noticed how Not Martin stayed carefully in the shadows, avoiding the direct light. Light hurts you, she realized aloud. Not Martin's expression hardened. Light disrupts the focusing, temporarily. In a sudden movement, Sarah yanked the nearest curtain fully open, sending a shaft of sunlight across the room. Not Martin recoiled, his form seeming to waver momentarily, revealing a glimpse of something shadowy and wrong beneath Martin's appearance. Sarah used the distraction to wrench open the front door and flee to her car. As she pulled away, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Martin standing in the doorway, but his reflection in the car's side mirror showed something else entirely. A tall, emaciated figure with elongated limbs and a featureless face. With no clear destination in mind, Sarah found herself driving toward the university. She needed information, and even if Dr. Chen wasn't available, perhaps his department had resources that could help her understand what she was facing and how to fight it. The anthropology department was housed in an old brick building on campus. Inside, Sarah found the department office and approached the receptionist, a young man with thick glasses. I need information about shadow folk legends, she said without preamble. It's an emergency. The receptionist blinked in surprise. That's specific. Are you a student here? No, I'm trying to reach Dr. Michael Chen. He wrote a paper on liminal entities in mining folklore. Dr. Chen is on sabbatical, but I know, in South Dakota. I need to see his research materials, his notes, anything he has on the subject. The receptionist seemed taken aback by her intensity. I can't just give you access to a professor's research without permission. Perhaps if you explained what this is regarding. Sarah hesitated, knowing how she would sound. I'm experiencing phenomena similar to what he described in his paper. I need to know if he found any accounts of people successfully sending these entities back. To her surprise, the receptionist's demeanor changed instantly. He glanced around to ensure no one was within earshot, then leaned forward. You've seen them, he whispered. In reflections. Photographs. Sarah nodded slowly, hope rising for the first time in days. You know about them? I'm Dr. Chen's research assistant. I'm cataloging his materials while he's away. He extended his hand. James Park. Sarah shook his hand, noticing his firm grip, solid, real, human. Sarah Blackwood. James's eyes widened. Blackwood? From Deadwood? Dr. Chen is in South Dakota investigating the Blackwood case specifically. Your family's case. James led Sarah to a small, cluttered office that apparently belonged to Dr. Chen. Filing cabinets lined one wall, while the others were covered with maps, photographs, and handwritten notes connected by red string, like something from a detective movie. Dr. Chen has been researching liminal entities for years, James explained, unlocking a cabinet. Most academics dismissed his work as folklore studies, but he believed these phenomena were real, manifestations of interdimensional beings that have been documented across cultures throughout history. He pulled out a thick folder labeled Blackwood Case and placed it on the desk. When he found references to your family in the Deadwood historical records, it became his obsession. The Blackwood incident is one of the most well-documented cases of what he calls focused intrusion. Sarah opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were photocopies of newspaper articles, journal entries and photographs, many of which she recognized from Aunt Eliza's collection. But there were also documents she hadn't seen before, including what appeared to be private letters between Jonathan Blackwood and various occultists of his era. Jonathan was searching for help, Sarah murmured, scanning a letter dated 1893. He knew what was happening but didn't know how to stop it. According to Dr. Chen's theory, your great-grandfather accidentally created a doorway through the portrait, James said. The artist, Peters, somehow sensed the entities and captured them in his painting. By focusing the eyes, he created points of connection between our dimension and theirs. "But how do I close the doorway?" Sarah asked desperately. In Deadwood, destroying the portrait seemed to work temporarily, but now they're back, stronger than before. James hesitated. Dr. Chen believed the doorway isn't in the portrait itself. It's in the perception. The act of focusing, of seeing these entities, strengthens their connection to our world. The more you look for them, the stronger they become. "So I'm making it worse by trying to understand them," Sarah realized, the irony bitter in her mouth. "Possibly, but Dr. Chen also found accounts of people who successfully repelled these intrusions." James rifled through another drawer and produced a slim journal. This is his personal research diary. He documented techniques from various cultures for closing interdimensional doorways. Sarah flipped through the journal, finding entries about ritual purifications, protective symbols, and more obscure methods involving mirrors and light. One passage caught her attention. Reflective surfaces serve as both conduits and barriers. The entities require focus to manifest, the concentrated attention of a consciousness that acknowledges their existence. Theoretically, a dispersal of focus should weaken their connection. "Dispersal of focus," Sarah repeated. "What does that mean?" James shook his head. "I'm not entirely sure. Dr. Chen was still developing this theory when he left for South Dakota. But I think he was interrupted by Sarah's phone ringing. The screen showed Martin's name, sending a chill down her spine. "Don't answer it," James warned, seeing her expression. "If these entities have partial control over your husband, they could be trying to locate you." Sarah silenced the phone, but moments later a text message appeared. "Coming for you. The exchange must be completed. Blood calls to blood." "They know I'm looking for ways to stop them," Sarah said, showing James the message. "We don't have much time." James looked thoughtful. Dr. Chen mentioned a theory about severing connections. The entities maintain their foothold through focused attention and blood ties. Breaking both could theoretically close the doorway permanently. "How do I break a blood tie?" "I'm not sure, but—" James stopped suddenly, staring at something over Sarah's shoulder. His expression changed, becoming unnaturally still. Sarah turned slowly, following his gaze to a small mirror hanging on the office wall. In the reflection, she could see both herself and James, but James's reflection wasn't matching his movements. While the real James stood frozen, his reflection smiled with too many teeth. "James?" Sarah whispered. When he spoke, his voice had changed, becoming deeper and slightly distorted. "Dr. Chen found us too, in Deadwood, at the old house site. We showed him what waits between. He sees clearly now." Sarah backed toward the door, her hope crumbling. They had reached James too, somehow. Had he been compromised all along, leading her into a trap? "The exchange spreads," not James continued, taking a step toward her. "Focus sharpens, doorways open, soon, very soon." Sarah bolted from the office, clutching Dr. Chen's journal. Behind her, she heard not James calling out with that wrong voice. "Blood calls to blood, Sarah Blackwood. You cannot unfocus what has been seen." Racing through the campus, Sarah found her car and drove without destination, her mind reeling. James, or whatever had been wearing James like a mask, had mentioned Dr. Chen finding them in Deadwood at the old house site. If Chen had discovered something important, something that could help her, she needed to go to Deadwood. But first, she needed to ensure Martin couldn't follow her. Whatever was controlling or impersonating him seemed to be able to track her. Her phone, that must be how. Sarah pulled into a shopping mall parking lot and removed the SIM card from her phone, then purchased a prepaid phone with cash from an electronics store. Next, she withdrew the maximum amount from an ATM, avoiding looking directly at the security camera mounted above it, and headed to the airport. Hours later, Sarah sat on a plane bound for Rapid City, the closest airport to Deadwood. She had left no electronic trail, paying cash for everything. As the plane took off, she allowed herself a moment of hope. Perhaps in Deadwood, where it all began, she could find a way to end this nightmare. During the flight, Sarah studied Dr. Chen's journal more carefully. Many of his notes were cryptic, written in shorthand or annotated with symbols she didn't understand. But certain passages stood out. The entities require 3 elements to fully manifest: a focused conduit, typically eyes in artistic representations, a blood connection to anchor them, and conscious perception that acknowledges their existence. Remove any of these elements, and their connection weakens. And later, JB attempted to close the doorway by defocusing the conduit, blurring the eyes in the portrait. Temporarily effective, but incomplete solution. The blood anchor remained. Modern descendants potentially at risk if they re-establish focus, which was exactly what had happened when Sarah had found the portrait. She had re-established the focus, reactivated the doorway. Another entry near the end of the journal read, "Theory. Complete dispersal of focus through fragmentation of perception might permanently sever the connection. The unified consciousness serves as the doorway, not the physical objects. Blackwood House demolition site may contain residual connection point. Must investigate directly." Sarah wasn't entirely sure what Chen meant by fragmentation of perception, but it seemed to be what he had gone to Deadwood to investigate. She needed to find him, or what had become of him. Landing in Rapid City as dusk fell, Sarah rented a car and drove the hour to Deadwood, arriving in the small historic town as darkness settled completely. The place looked different than when she'd last seen it. Tourist season was over and the streets were quiet, the old west facades of the buildings looking eerie in the glow of street lamps. The developer who had purchased the Blackwood house had told Sarah that demolition would begin in late fall. As she drove to the outskirts of town, where the property stood, she wondered if anything remained of the house where her nightmare had begun. What she found surprised her. The house still stood, though construction equipment surrounded it, demolition delayed, perhaps by weather or permits. A chain-link fence encircled the property, with no trespassing signs posted at intervals. Sarah parked down the road and approached on foot, using a small flashlight to guide her way. The fence wasn't difficult to climb, and soon she stood on the overgrown lawn, staring up at the dark silhouette of the house that had been in her family for generations. As she approached the porch, Sarah noticed something odd. Light flickering from within the house, visible through gaps in the boarded-up windows. Someone was inside. Taking a deep breath, Sarah tried the front door and found it unlocked. She stepped into the foyer, memories flooding back, both of her childhood visits and the more recent nightmare with Martin. The flickering light came from the parlor, where she and Martin had first discovered the portrait, with the blurred eyes. "Hello," she called softly, her voice echoing in the empty house. "Dr. Chen, are you here?" The only response was a faint rustling sound from the parlor. Sarah moved cautiously toward it, her flashlight beam joining the wavering light that she now realized came from candles arranged in a circle on the floor. In the center of the circle sat a man with his back to her, cross-legged, staring at what appeared to be fragments of the portrait she had defaced months earlier. The canvas had been cut into dozens of pieces, arranged in a spiral pattern. "Dr. Chen," Sarah ventured. The man turned slowly and Sarah gasped. It was indeed Michael Chen, according to the faculty photo she had seen, but his appearance was shocking. His eyes were bloodshot, his face gaunt, as if he hadn't slept or eaten properly in days. Most disturbing were his arms, which were covered in intricate patterns drawn in what looked like dried blood. "Sarah Blackwood," he said, his voice hoarse but human, no trace of the distortion she had heard in Martin and James. "I've been waiting for you. They told me you would come." Sarah remained in the doorway, unwilling to step closer to the strange ritual scene Dr. Chen had created. "Who told you I would come?" she asked cautiously. Chen smiled wearily. "The Watchers, the ones between. I've learned to hear them without letting them through." He gestured to the symbols drawn on his arms. "Protection, partial focusing that allows perception without providing a conduit." "You can see them without letting them possess you?" Sarah asked, hope flaring despite her apprehension. "Not possess, Replace, Chen corrected. They don't take over existing consciousness, they substitute their own. The original is displaced, stored perhaps, but essentially removed from this plane of existence. Sarah thought of Martin, of the thing wearing his face. Can the original be restored? Chen's expression grew somber. I believe so, but only if the substitution is incomplete. Once the exchange is finalized, the displacement becomes permanent. He studied her intently. Someone close to you has been affected. My husband, Sarah admitted, and a research assistant at your university, James Park. Chen winced. James! I feared they might target him. He had access to my research. He gestured for Sarah to join him in the circle. Come. It's safe here. The candles create a barrier of sorts. They disrupt the shadows, where these entities exist partially in our dimension. Still hesitant, Sarah stepped into the circle of light. Up close, she could see that the portrait fragments were arranged in a specific pattern, the pieces positioned so that no single eye from the painting remained intact. The focus literally fragmented. What are they? Sarah asked, sitting across from Chen. These shadow folk or watchers or whatever they are. I believe they're interdimensional entities that exist in the spaces between realities, Chen explained, his academic demeanor incongruous with his wild appearance. They've been documented in folklore worldwide. Shadow people, flitzers, Merkit's Chainera. They cannot fully exist in our dimension without a vessel, a physical form to anchor them. But why do they want to come through at all? Chen shrugged. Why does any life form seek to expand its territory? Our dimension offers resources theirs doesn't. Physical sensation, perhaps, or some form of energy we don't understand. I suspect they feed on focused attention itself, on being perceived. How do we stop them? Sarah asked, cutting to the heart of her concern. The focusing must be completely dispersed, Chen said, indicating the fragmented portrait. Jonathan Blackwood attempted this by blurring the eyes in the portrait, but his solution was incomplete because he kept the second portrait, the one with focused eyes, hidden away. A part of him wanted to maintain the connection, to use their knowledge. I destroyed both portraits, Sarah pointed out, but they still followed me, appeared in photographs, in reflections. Chen nodded. Because the focusing had already shifted from the portraits to human perception. Once they're seen, acknowledged as real, human consciousness itself becomes the conduit. He tapped his temple. The doorway is in here now, not in any physical object. So how do I close a doorway in my mind? That's what I've been working on. Chen indicated the ritual circle around them. Fragmentation of perception, breaking the unified focus that they use as a doorway. The symbols I've marked myself with are from various traditions, designs meant to confuse evil spirits, to make them see many where there is one. Sarah studied the blood-drawn patterns on Chen's arms. And this works? Partially. It prevents full manifestation, but doesn't close the doorway entirely. Chen leaned forward, his intensity unnerving. But I've found something else. Records from a shaman who worked with miners in the 1890s. He claimed the only permanent solution was to redirect the blood anchor. The blood anchor? The blood connection, the genetic link that allows these entities to find specific humans across generations. Jonathan Blackwood established that connection, and it's followed his bloodline to you. Chen's eyes gleamed in the candlelight, but blood can be redirected. The anchor point shifted. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. What exactly does that mean? Before Chen could answer, a noise from upstairs made both of them freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moved across the ceiling above them. Someone else is here, Sarah whispered. Chen's expression darkened. Not someone, something. They've found us. The footsteps descended the stairs, each creak amplified in the empty house. Sarah's heart raced as a figure appeared in the doorway. Martin, or what looked like Martin, his silhouette wrong somehow against the darkness of the hallway. Sarah, not Martin said, his voice carrying that subtle distortion she had come to dread. You've led us to the source. How helpful. Behind him appeared another figure, James Park, his movements similarly off, his smile too wide. "Dr. Chen," not James said, "your research has been most illuminating. We understand now how to make the exchange permanent." Chen grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her to her feet. "Stay in the light," he hissed. "They can't fully manifest in direct illumination." Not Martin took a step into the room, but remained at the edge of the candlelight. "The blood anchor calls us. The focusing strengthens us. Soon, very soon, the doorway will be permanently open." "What do you want?" Sarah demanded, finding courage in Chen's steady presence beside her. "To be," not James answered simply, "to exist fully in this dimension, to feel, to live." "At the cost of human lives," Chen countered, "displacing existing consciousness." Not Martin smiled unnaturally. "A necessary exchange. This world has room for new kinds of beings." As they spoke, Sarah noticed the shadows in the room behaving strangely, stretching toward the circle of candles, pulsing like living things. Beyond, not Martin and not James, more shapes were gathering in the darkness of the hallway, human-like but wrong, their proportions distorted. "They're gathering strength," Chen murmured to Sarah, "preparing for something." Not James took another step forward, his foot almost touching the circle of candles. "Dr. Chen knows how to complete the exchange. Don't you, Doctor? The blood ritual, the final focusing." Chen's grip on Sarah's arm tightened. "We need to leave, now." "There's nowhere to go," Not Martin said, gesturing to the shadows that now surrounded the circle of light. "The house is filled with us. We are between every thought, behind every blink." Sarah noticed that the candles were burning lower, the circle of light shrinking. Soon, the shadows would reach them. "The fragmentation," Sarah whispered to Chen. "You said it works partially. Show me how." Chen hesitated, then quickly used his finger to draw one of the symbols from his arm onto Sarah's wrist, using candle soot. "Focus on this symbol while thinking of its opposite. Light and dark, present and past, here and not here. Split your perception between contradictions." Sarah tried to follow his instructions, staring at the symbol while holding opposing concepts in her mind simultaneously. It was like trying to see a magic eye picture, straining to perceive two realities at once. As she concentrated, something strange happened. The edges of her vision began to splinter, as if she were looking through a cracked lens. The room seemed to exist in multiple states at once, empty and occupied, light and dark, present and past. Through this fractured perception, Sarah saw the shadow folk more clearly, not as human imitations, but as their true selves, tall, spindly creatures with elongated limbs and featureless faces, their bodies seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. "I can see them," she gasped. "They're real forms." "Don't focus on them," Chen warned. "That strengthens their connection. Keep your perception fragmented." But it was too late. By seeing their true forms, Sarah had inadvertently provided them with another point of focus, another anchor in reality. The shadow nearest to her, the one wearing Martin's appearance, suddenly lunged forward, crossing the barrier of candlelight as if it no longer affected him. Chen shoved Sarah aside, placing himself between her and the entity. "Run!" he shouted. "Find the blood anchor and redirect it." Not Martin seized Chen by the throat, lifting him off the ground with inhuman strength. The other entities surged forward, no longer confined by the fading circle of light. Sarah had no choice but to flee. She darted past Not James, who grasped at her but missed and ran into the hallway. Behind her she heard Chen's choked cry cut suddenly short. The house had become a labyrinth of shadows, each room seeming to shift and change as she passed through it. Sarah headed for the stairs, intending to find the study where Aunt Eliza's genealogy records had been kept. If the blood anchor was the key, perhaps those documents contained the answer. As she reached the second floor, Sarah heard movement below. The entities pursuing her, their not-quite-human footsteps echoing through the house. She ducked into the study, finding it empty of furniture, but still lined with built-in bookshelves. In the beam of her flashlight, Sarah noticed something odd. A section of the floorboards that didn't match the others. Newer wood in a rectangular shape about 2 feet long. Someone had repaired the floor recently, or perhaps hidden something beneath it. With desperate strength, Sarah pried up the loose boards, revealing a small space beneath. Inside lay a metal box, the kind used for documents or valuables. She grabbed it and retreated to a corner of the room as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs. The box wasn't locked. Inside, Sarah found a leather-bound journal and a small cloth pouch. The journal was Jonathan Blackwood's private diary, its pages filled with increasingly frantic entries documenting his dealings with the shadow folk and his attempts to contain them after realizing what he had unleashed. The final entry, dated January 1893, read, "The shaman says the blood anchor can be transferred to an object through ritual. The shadow folk will follow the strongest blood connection. I have prepared the vessel as instructed. My own blood mixed with earth from the deepest mine, sealed with gold. If I am successful, the anchor will be contained and the doorway will close behind them. If I fail, may God have mercy on my bloodline." And the cloth pouch contained a small object wrapped in yellowed linen. Sarah carefully unwrapped it, revealing a gold pendant shaped like a mining pick, crossed with a key. The pendant was discolored in places with what appeared to be dried blood. "The blood anchor," Sarah whispered, understanding dawning. Jonathan hadn't just hidden a second portrait. He had created a physical anchor for the entities, binding them to an object rather than his bloodline. But somehow, the connection had remained or been re-established when Sarah returned to Deadwood. The door to the study burst open. Not Martin stood in the doorway, his form now flickering between Martin's appearance and something else. Something tall and wrong and ancient. "The vessel," it said, its voice no longer even attempting to sound human. "You've found it. Give it to us." Sarah clutched the pendant, backing away. "This is what keeps you connected to my family. If I destroy it, then the blood anchor returns to the bloodline," the entity finished. "To you. You cannot destroy the connection, only redirect it." Behind Not Martin appeared more entities, some wearing familiar faces, James, Dr. Chen, others appearing as vague human shapes with indistinct features. They were gathering, focusing their attention on Sarah and the pendant she held. "The final focusing approaches," Not Martin intoned. "The exchange will be completed. Give us the vessel." Sarah's mind raced. According to Jonathan's journal, the pendant was a container for the blood anchor, redirecting it from his bloodline to the object. If the entity was right, destroying it would only return the anchor to her. But perhaps that was the key, not destroying the connection but redirecting it again. Jonathan had used his blood mixed with earth and gold. Sarah had his blood in her veins. If she could somehow recreate the ritual, transfer the anchor to something else. The entity that wore Martin's face took a step into the room, its movements becoming more fluid, more natural, as if it were settling more comfortably into its stolen form. "We have waited long enough," it said. "The vessel. Now." In a desperate gamble, Sarah pressed the sharp edge of the pendant against her palm, drawing blood. "You want a blood anchor?" she challenged. "Come and take it." She darted past the entity, using its moment of surprise to her advantage, and ran for the stairs. The pendant left a smear of her blood on Not Martin's arm as she passed. A new connection, a new focusing point. The house seemed to come alive around her, shadows peeling from walls and ceilings to reach for her as she fled. Sarah reached the first floor and raced toward the parlor where Dr. Chen had created his ritual circle. The candles still burned, though lower now. In the center lay the fragmented portrait pieces, arranged in their spiral pattern. Sarah knelt in the circle, pressing her bleeding palm against the largest fragment, the piece containing Jonathan Blackwood's face. "Blood calls to blood," she whispered, echoing the entity's own words. "I redirect the anchor." Not to me, not to any living Blackwood. The pendant in her hand grew warm, then hot, as if responding to her blood. The entities flooded into the room, surrounding the circle of candlelight, their forms shifting between human appearances and their true shapes, as Sarah's fractured perception saw them both ways simultaneously. "What are you doing?" Not Martin demanded, its voice fluctuating between Martin's familiar tones and something ancient and hollow. "Completing the ritual Jonathan started," Sarah answered, her voice steadier than she felt. "He redirected the blood anchor to this pendant. I'm redirecting it again, back to him, back to the past, a blood connection to someone who no longer exists." The idea had come to her from Chen's fragmentation technique, splitting perception between contradictions. Jonathan Blackwood was both her ancestor and long dead, both connected to her by blood and separated by time. If the anchor could be redirected to that paradox, perhaps the doorway could be collapsed. "It won't work," Not Martin snarled, but uncertainty had crept into its voice. "The blood anchor requires a living vessel." "Does it?" Sarah countered, pressing the pendant harder against the portrait fragment. "Or does it simply require the strongest blood connection? Jonathan Blackwood began this. His blood called you through. His blood will send you back." The air in the room grew heavy, charged with something that raised the hair on Sarah's arms. The shadows surrounding the circle began to waver, as if affected by heat distortion. Not Martin took a halting step forward, then another, its movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated. "The focusing shifts," it said, its voice fracturing between Martin's and the hollow whisper. "The doorway bends." Sarah continued the improvised ritual, not knowing if what she was attempting was possible, but driven by desperate intuition. "I return the anchor to Jonathan Blackwood, to dust and memory. The doorway closes, the focusing disperses." The pendant in her hand pulsed with heat, the gold seeming to soften and flow around the dried blood. The portrait fragment beneath her palm began to smoke slightly, the painted image darkening as if being burned from within. Around her, the entities were changing, their borrowed human appearances flickering and failing, revealing more of their true forms. Not Martin stumbled, falling to its knees at the edge of the circle, its features shifting rapidly between Martin and something else. "You cannot undo the exchange," it gasped, reaching toward her with a hand that elongated unnaturally. "We are already here." "Not fully," Sarah countered. "Not yet. The exchange isn't complete." As she spoke, she realized the truth of her words. If the exchange had been completed, these entities wouldn't still be struggling to maintain their forms. Something was holding them back. Perhaps Dr. Chen's fragmentation technique, perhaps her own splintered perception that refused to provide them with a clear focusing point. The pendant in her hand suddenly cracked, a fissure appearing down its center. Golden light spilled from the crack, illuminating the room more brightly than the candles. The entities recoiled from the light, their forms becoming insubstantial, wavering like heat mirages. Not Martin's appearance dissolved entirely, revealing the true form of the entity, a tall, spindly creature of living shadow, its limbs too long, its head featureless, except for indentations where eyes should be. It reached for Sarah with elongated fingers that seemed to both exist and not exist simultaneously. "The doorway," it whispered, its voice no longer anything like Martin's. "Closing." Udrei, the pendant shattered in Sarah's hand, fragments of gold and dried blood scattering across the portrait pieces. A shockwave of golden light exploded outward from the center of the circle, passing through the shadowy entities like a wind through smoke. Their forms dispersed, unraveling into wisps of darkness that were quickly consumed by the expanding light. Sarah heard a sound like 1,000 whispers suddenly silenced, and then nothing. The candles had been extinguished by the shockwave, leaving Sarah alone in darkness. She fumbled for her flashlight, hands shaking as she switched it on. The room was empty. No shadow entities, no distorted versions of Martin or James or Dr. Chen. Just an abandoned house with fragments of a portrait scattered across the floor. Had it worked? Had she redirected the blood anchor, closed the doorway, or had the entities simply retreated, temporarily banished, but not truly gone? Sarah gathered the portrait fragments and the shattered remains of the pendant, placing them in the metal box from the study. Whatever had happened, she wouldn't leave these things behind. They needed to be properly destroyed, the connection severed completely. As she left the house, the first light of dawn was breaking over the Black Hills. Sarah felt hollow, drained by her ordeal, but also lighter somehow, as if a weight she hadn't fully recognized had been lifted. But one question remained, heavy on her heart. If she had closed the doorway, sent the entities back to their between space, what had happened to Martin, to James and Dr. Chen? Were they gone forever, displaced by the shadow folk, or was there a chance they could return? Sarah drove back to her hotel in Deadwood, exhaustion settling into her bones. She needed rest before she could face whatever came next. In her room, she placed the metal box containing the portrait fragments and shattered pendant in the hotel safe, unwilling to have them near while she slept. For the first time in weeks, Sarah's sleep was dreamless and deep. No shadowy figures watched from the corners. No whispered voices disturbed her rest. When she woke, late in the afternoon, the world seemed oddly normal, almost jarringly so after the nightmare she had lived through. Sarah's first thought was of Martin. She needed to know if he was still alive, if closing the doorway had somehow restored him. But how could she tell if the entity was truly gone? It had worn Martin's face, spoken with almost his voice. If it answered her call, would she be able to tell the difference? There was only one way to find out. Sarah used her new prepaid phone to call their home number in Seattle. After 4 rings, voicemail picked up. Martin's recorded voice, normal and familiar, asking her to leave a message. "Martin, it's me," she said after the beep. "If you're there, the real you, please call this number. I think it's over, but I need to know you're okay." Next, she called the anthropology department at the University of Washington, asking for James Park. The receptionist informed her that James hadn't come in for several days and wasn't answering his phone. "Is there an emergency contact on file for him?" Sarah asked. "His sister in Portland," the receptionist replied. "We've already reached out to her. She's filing a missing persons report." After hanging up, Sarah sat on the edge of the hotel bed, unsure what to do next. Had she closed the doorway only to lose Martin forever? The thought was unbearable. Her phone rang, startling her. Unknown number. "Hello?" she answered cautiously. "Sarah?" The voice on the other end was familiar but weak, exhausted. "It's Martin. Where are you? What happened?" Sarah's heart leaped. "Martin? Is it really you?" "Of course it's me," he replied, confusion evident in his voice. "I woke up in the hospital. They said I was found unconscious in our backyard 2 days ago. I've been trying to reach you, but your phone was disconnected." "The hospital?" Sarah struggled to process this information. "Are you okay?" "Dehydrated and disoriented, but otherwise fine, according to the doctors." "Sarah, what's going on?" "The last thing I remember clearly is being in the attic at that house in Deadwood, and then fragments, nightmares, like I was trapped inside myself, watching someone else use my body." Tears of relief sprang to Sarah's eyes. It was him, the real Martin. Somehow, closing the doorway had expelled the entity, returning Martin's consciousness to his body. "It's a long story," she said. "I'm still in Deadwood. I'll explain everything when I get home." "Deadwood? What are you doing back there?" "Finishing what we started," Sarah replied. "Ending it." After assuring Martin she would be on the next flight home, Sarah hung up and immediately called the hospital he'd mentioned, confirming that he was indeed a patient there and had been admitted 2 days ago, right around the time she'd performed the ritual with the pendant and portrait fragments. As she packed her few belongings, Sarah's phone rang again. This time, it was a number with a South Dakota area code. "Ms. Blackwood, this is Sheriff Tom Wilkins from Lawrence County. I understand you might have information about a missing person. Dr. Michael Chen from the University of Washington. Sarah's pulse quickened. Has something happened to him? He was found this morning by hikers near the old Blackwood property, the sheriff explained. Disoriented and exposed to the elements, but alive. He's at Deadwood Regional Hospital now. He's been asking for you. The hospital corridors were quiet as Sarah followed a nurse to Dr. Chen's room. Outside, darkness had fallen again, the short autumn day already surrendered to night. Chen lay in the hospital bed, an IV in his arm and monitors tracking his vital signs. His appearance had improved from the wild-eyed, blood-marked man she had encountered in the Blackwood house. His face was clean, his hair combed, though deep exhaustion lined his features. "Sarah Blackwood," he said as she entered, his voice hoarse but steady. "You did it." Sarah took a seat beside his bed. "You remember?" Chen nodded slowly. "Not everything. It's like trying to recall a dream that keeps slipping away. I remember the ritual circle, the entities coming for us." He paused, his gaze distant. "I remember being somewhere else, watching through my own eyes, but unable to control my body. The entity that took you, it's gone now?" "Yes," Chen confirmed. "When I regained consciousness in the woods near your family's property, I could feel the difference immediately. The presence that had been shadowing me for weeks was gone. The doorway has been closed." "What about the others?" Sarah asked. "The entities that took Martin and James. If you truly redirected the blood anchor, they would have been pulled back as well." Chen's expression grew troubled. "The ritual you performed, using your blood to redirect the anchor to Jonathan Blackwood's painted image, was brilliant but dangerous. You created a paradox, a blood connection to someone who no longer exists physically, but persists through representation and lineage." "It was instinct more than planning," Sarah admitted. "I just knew the anchor needed to go somewhere other than me or the pendant." Chen nodded appreciatively. "Instinct, guided by knowledge. You understood enough about their nature to exploit the contradiction they couldn't resolve." He reached for a cup of water, wincing as the movement pulled at his IV. "Have you heard from your husband or James?" Sarah told him about Martin's call and his apparent recovery. "I haven't heard anything about James yet. We should check on him as soon as possible," Chen said. "The entities may have been expelled, but their victims will need time to recover. The experience of being displaced leaves psychological scars." "What exactly happened to them, to you, when the entities took over?" Sarah asked, needing to understand what Martin had endured. Chen was silent for a moment, his expression haunted. "It's difficult to describe. Imagine being pushed into the background of your own consciousness, aware but unable to act, like being buried alive in your own mind." He shuddered slightly. "I could see what the entity was doing with my body, hear what it was saying with my voice, but I couldn't interfere. I was just watching." "Martin said he remembers fragments, nightmares," Sarah said. "Yes, that sounds right. The longer the entity controls the vessel, the more the original consciousness fragments, losing cohesion." Chen's gaze sharpened. "Which is why James's situation concerns me. If he was taken early, before I left for Deadwood—" "I'll call the university again when I get back to Seattle," Sarah promised. "Make sure he's been found." Chen nodded, then asked, "What did you do with the portrait fragments and the pendant?" "They're locked in my hotel safe. I was planning to destroy them completely before I leave." "Good, though I suspect they're now just objects, no longer conduits." "Ooh." Chen leaned back against his pillows, fatigue evident in his movements. "The blood anchor has been redirected, the focusing dispersed. The doorway should remain closed." "Should?" Sarah caught the uncertainty in his tone. Chen sighed. "In my research, I've never found a case where the entities were permanently banished, contained, redirected, but never truly gone. They exist in the spaces between. They're always there, watching, waiting for another point of focus, another doorway." So this could happen again." The thought sent a chill through Sarah. "Not in the same way," Chen assured her. "The specific connection through your family line has been severed. But there are other potential doorways, other methods of focusing. He reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. Which is why my work must continue. I need to document what happened, add it to the body of knowledge about these phenomena. The more we understand, the better we can protect ourselves. Sarah wasn't sure she wanted to remain involved in Chen's research, but she understood his motivation. I'll tell you everything I experienced, help you document it. But after that, I just want to go home and try to put this behind me. Chen smiled sadly. I understand, but Sarah, be vigilant. Watch for signs. Just because you closed one doorway doesn't mean there aren't others. As Sarah left the hospital, Chen's warning echoed in her mind. The night seemed darker somehow, the shadows between street lamps deeper. She found herself avoiding looking too directly at her reflection in the windows of parked cars, still uneasy about what might be looking back. At her hotel, Sarah retrieved the metal box from the safe. Inside, the portrait fragments lay scattered, the painted faces now dull and lifeless. Ordinary pigment on canvas, nothing more. The shattered pendant had lost its luster, the gold looking tarnished and old. Following an impulse she couldn't quite explain, Sarah took the box to a deserted stretch of road outside town. There, she dug a small hole and buried the box, marking the spot with a circle of stones. It felt right somehow, returning these objects to the earth near where it had all begun. Back in her hotel room, Sarah packed for her early morning flight, eager to return to Seattle, to Martin, to whatever remained of their normal life. As she closed her suitcase, her phone rang. Martin again. "I'm coming home tomorrow," she told him. "How are you feeling?" "Better," he said, his voice stronger than before. "They're releasing me in the morning. Sarah, I've been having these strange memory flashes, things I did, places I went, but it wasn't me. Was something controlling me?" "Yes," Sarah answered simply, deciding that Martin deserved the truth, however impossible it might sound. There were entities, shadow folk, that could take human forms. One of them took yours for a while. There was a long silence on the other end. Then, "I believe you. I remember glimpses. It was watching you for a long time, waiting, and there were others, so many others, in the spaces between everything." His voice shook slightly. "Are they gone now?" "Yes," Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. "They're gone. We're safe." But as she spoke, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the darkened window of her hotel room, her reflection's lips weren't moving in sync with her words. "Just a trick of the light," she told herself firmly. Just nerves and exhaustion playing tricks on her perception. But she turned on every light in the room before trying to sleep, and still found herself watching the shadows until dawn broke over the Black Hills. 1 year later, Sarah sat in her Seattle office, finishing notes on her last therapy patient of the day. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. Typical November weather that no longer triggered the anxiety it once had. Life had largely returned to normal in the months following Deadwood. Martin had recovered fully, with only occasional nightmares to remind him of his ordeal. They never spoke of the shadow folk or the portrait, as if by mutual agreement that naming these things might somehow invite them back. James Park had eventually been found wandering in a park near the university campus, disoriented but physically unharmed. He had no memory of the preceding weeks and eventually left his position at the anthropology department, moving back to his hometown in Oregon. Dr. Chen had made a more complete recovery, his academic mind processing the trauma differently. He had returned to his research with renewed vigor, publishing a paper on perceptual fragmentation as psychological defense against intrusive phenomena that carefully avoided any direct reference to interdimensional entities. He and Sarah corresponded occasionally, sharing observations, but never explicitly discussing what they had experienced. Sarah had developed her own coping mechanisms. She avoided lingering in front of mirrors and rarely looked at photographs for too long. She kept lights on in dark rooms and slept with a small lamp glowing throughout the night. Small precautions, perhaps unnecessary, but they helped her feel secure. Most importantly, she had learned to unfocus her perception when unease crept in, to see the world through slightly blurred vision, never staring too intently at shadows or reflections, the opposite of the focusing that had strengthened the entity's connection. As Sarah packed up her notes, her office phone rang. The receptionist had left for the day, so she answered directly. Dr. Blackwood's office. Sarah, the voice was familiar. Dr. Chen, I need to speak with you urgently. Something in his tone sent a prickle of alarm down her spine. What's wrong? Not over the phone, Chen replied. Are you still at your office? I'm in Seattle for a conference. I can be there in 20 minutes. Yes, I'll wait, Sarah said, unsettled by the urgency in his voice. While waiting for Chen, Sarah found herself pacing her office, avoiding looking directly at the darkened window where rain streaked the glass. What could be so important that Chen needed to speak to her in person after months of minimal contact? When he arrived, Chen looked much as he had when she'd last seen him, academic and composed, though perhaps more tired, with new lines etched around his eyes. He carried a leather portfolio, similar to the one Aunt Eliza had kept her genealogy records in. Thank you for seeing me, he said, taking a seat across from her desk. I wouldn't have come if it wasn't important. What's happened? Sarah asked, bracing herself. Chen opened the portfolio and removed several photographs, placing them carefully on her desk. These were taken at various locations over the past year: Deadwood, Seattle, Portland, where James relocated, even my university office. Sarah reluctantly looked at the images. They appeared to be ordinary photographs of places: streets, buildings, interiors of rooms. Nothing unusual. I don't see anything, she said, relieved. Exactly, Chen replied, his expression grave. Look at the shadows, the reflective surfaces. Nothing there, nothing watching from the edges, no signs of intrusion. Isn't that good news? Sarah asked, confused by his concern. It would be, if not for this. Chen placed one final photograph on the desk. This was taken yesterday, near the site where your family's house stood in Deadwood. The developer finally demolished it last month. Sarah studied the image. A construction site, with the foundation of a new building visible. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until she noticed what Chen had seen. In the reflective surface of a puddle, a distinctive, elongated shadow that didn't match any of the objects or people in the frame. They're coming back, she whispered, her mouth suddenly dry. I don't think they ever left, Chen corrected. I think they changed tactics. After you redirected the blood anchor and closed that particular doorway, they retreated, regrouped. They're patient, remember. They exist outside our understanding of time. But why appear now? Why there? Chen leaned forward. Because something disturbed the site, the demolition, the new construction, and because they found a new approach. He tapped the photograph. Notice how subtle this manifestation is. Not a full appearance in a portrait or mirror, just a slight discrepancy in a reflection. They're being more cautious, more gradual. What does this mean for us? Sarah asked, though she feared she knew the answer. It means we need to be vigilant. They haven't given up on finding a way through. Chen hesitated, then added, There's something else. I've been monitoring missing persons cases with unusual circumstances. People found wandering with no memory, sudden personality changes, individuals acting out of character before disappearing. And the frequency is increasing. Clusters around certain locations, including Seattle. Chen met her eyes directly. I believe they're testing new vessels, new methods of manifestation. Sarah felt cold, despite the warmth of her office. Why are you telling me this? What can I do? Because you successfully closed a doorway. You redirected the blood anchor, something no one else has managed to do. Chen's expression was earnest. I've continued my research into fragmentation techniques, ways to disperse focus and perception. I believe we can develop more effective protections, perhaps even find a way to close the spaces between permanently. We? Sarah echoed, tension building in her chest. I can't go through that again, Michael. I can't risk Martin, my practice, my life. I understand, Chen said softly, but Sarah, you're already involved. We all are, everyone who has seen them, who knows they exist. Our awareness itself is a potential doorway. Sarah stood, moving to the window where rain continued to fall in the darkening evening. In the glass, she caught her reflection, and for just an instant, thought she saw something else there too, watching from behind her eyes. Just nerves, she told herself firmly. Just Chen's revelations, stirring up old fears. What exactly are you proposing? She asked without turning. A research partnership, Chen replied. Combining your psychological expertise with my anthropological approach. We document cases, develop protective techniques, create a body of knowledge that can help others who encounter these phenomena. Sarah thought of Martin, of the months it had taken him to recover from his ordeal, of James, who had abandoned his career and fled, of the countless others who might face similar horrors without understanding what was happening to them. I won't actively seek them out, she said finally. I won't look for doorways or try to communicate with them, but I'll help document what we know, develop psychological frameworks for understanding and resisting intrusion. Chen nodded, accepting her conditions. That's all I ask. Knowledge is our best defense. As Chen gathered his photographs, Sarah noticed something she had missed before. In each image, while there were no obvious signs of the shadow folk, there was a subtle distortion in the quality of the shadows themselves, as if they were somehow deeper than they should be. They're still there, she said, not really a question. In the spaces between, watching. Yes, Chen confirmed, but watching isn't the same as coming through. As long as we maintain fragmented perception, avoid providing clear points of focus, they remain limited to their own dimension. After Chen left, Sarah remained in her office, the rain tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. She found herself practicing the unfocusing technique she had developed, seeing the world through slightly blurred vision, never allowing her perception to settle too concretely on any one thing. In this state of dispersed awareness, Sarah thought she could almost sense them, the watchers between, the shadow folk, hovering just beyond the threshold of reality. Not gone, never truly gone, but contained for now behind a doorway that refused to focus clearly. As she gathered her things to leave, Sarah avoided looking directly at the mirrors, the windows, the darkened computer screen, not from fear, but from strategy, denying them the focus they needed to find their way through. Outside, in the rainy evening, the street lamps created pools of light, separated by deeper darkness. Sarah walked confidently through both, no longer afraid of what might lurk in the shadows, but aware of their presence nonetheless. The doorway had been closed, the blood anchor redirected, but other doorways existed, other methods of focusing. The shadow folk were patient, eternal, existing in the spaces between all things. Sarah's phone rang as she reached her car. Martin, checking when she'd be home for dinner. His voice was warm, normal, entirely his own. This was the reality she chose to focus on, the life she had reclaimed. As she drove home through the rain-slick streets, Sarah glanced briefly at her rearview mirror and thought she saw, just for an instant, something moving in the back seat. A suggestion of elongated limbs and a featureless face. She deliberately unfocused her eyes, dispersing her perception. And when she looked again, there was nothing there but ordinary shadows. We see what we choose to focus on, she murmured to herself, a mantra she had developed in the months since Deadwood. And some things are better left unfocused. In her pocket, the small fragment of Jonathan Blackwood's portrait that she had kept, against her better judgment, against all reason, seemed to pulse warmly, like a heartbeat. A reminder, a warning, a connection to something that existed beyond normal perception. Sarah drove on through the gathering darkness, eyes slightly unfocused, aware of the watching presence in the spaces between, but refusing to provide it with the doorway it sought. Some battles weren't about winning, but about maintaining a careful, eternal vigilance. Behind her, in the deepening shadows of Seattle's rainy evening, Something watched and waited, patient as only the eternal can be.